But yeah, speaking of bright prospects and bright young players, teenagers, there's Eduardo Camavinga, who has also been linked to Manchester United this summer, and that's one which is rightly so going to get people excited because he's a player who obviously came through at Stade Rennes at 16, 17. I believe he's still only 18 years old, or has only recently turned 18. He's an exceptionally talented player for his age, and I think he's another one who's essentially going to come out of Liga and be a real protagonist in European football for many years to come. But unsurprisingly, clubs of Manchester United stature are reportedly interested. Hypothetically, where would you see him fitting into this Manchester United team? Because I've seen informed sources and perhaps some more uninformed sources speculating over this. What would be your opinion on that?
I think ultimately, what we're looking at in this situation is a player who's going to slot into the right side of Solskjaer's defensive pivot or midfield pivot rather. Um, and I think there's a lot of questions as to fit, as to whether that really makes sense, especially since I think most people feel that United need a sitting defensive midfielder who can be a single pivot behind Pogba and Bruno. How realistic that is, I'm not sure I care to speculate. Um, but yeah, I think ultimately Kamavinga would be the right side of that midfield pivot, replacing McTominay. Because I think ultimately, however you feel about McTominay, I think Kamavinga's skill set is sort of a superset of McTominay's, and ultimately, whether there's imbalance in that McTominay-Fred pivot, I think some of it would be addressed by making that change, and ultimately, Kamavinga's ceiling is non-existent.
Yeah, it is just so much higher, and I'm glad you said that he'd fit in, or hypothetically on the right side, because I was seeing some sort of lineup graphics on Twitter, and it had Pogba as that player, and I was thinking, right, so how much thought has gone into this? Because I'm not so sure that would work, but I think there's been the temptation to make I think lazy comparisons between Camavinga and Paul Pogba, because they're both very languid players, both very tall. There's obviously the link, the French international link. But I'm glad that you mentioned about McTominay sort of being as Camavinga possessing maybe a super skill set of McTominay's, because I do think that is the closer comparison. I think, I mean, you say you'd play him on that right side of that midfield pivot. I mean, one thing from watching Camavinga is that he's extraordinarily one-footed. He's very, very, he very much prefers his left to his right in terms of playing passes, receiving. Is that something which if again hypothetically, if you were in charge, and is that something that you would perhaps hold off? Something which would make you hold off on signing a player who is admittedly very young, because he perhaps doesn't have, his movements may be telegraphed at a higher level in the Premier League?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure it would make me hold off, just because, like you said, he's extremely young, and not only is he extremely young, he's shown himself to be hyper effective, despite what was to some extent a down year this year, in a pretty high level league. Whether obviously there's differences in quality and style of play between France and England, but I think you've seen enough to feel that however many passing angles are going to be cut off for Kamavinga, he'll make up for it by being this brilliant ball carrier. Though yes, his one-footedness can honestly affect that as well. But I think I would still pull the trigger on this. I'm not sure that's enough for me to be put off.
Okay, yeah, no, fair enough. I think, I mean, it was a something which I was curious about, because it is very apparent. As soon as you
Yeah,
notice it, somebody raised it to me a little while ago, and it's something which I hadn't really noticed. And then as soon as I did, every time I watched him, I was like, I kind of know where he's going to play this ball next, because if he's got two options on, and one is is a great deal easier to complete the pass with his left foot, I essentially know 9 times out of 10, 95 times out of 100, he's going to play that pass because it's on his left foot and it's the natural passing lane. But that's only one aspect of his game, and I think I'm probably being a little bit harsh on him there, kind of dragging out his weaknesses so early, because he is such a talented player. I think, his ball carrying, as you mentioned there, that is something which is, for his age, is immense, because you think a lot of the, I mean, it reminds me in a way of Frankie De Jong, in terms of that he's just very deceptively good at getting out of tight spaces, and it just seems natural. In the way that when Frankie was at Ajax, and how he'd receive, he'd scan, he'd take a touch, and then he'd kind of just glide through the challenges that perhaps another player might stumble into trouble in. With Camavinga, obviously has he's 6'2", 6'3", I believe, which obviously helps a great deal when you've got that frame. But I think that is one of those areas where he really is already at a level where he's potentially world beating.
Yeah, and I think with regard to the weakness, I think it's better, especially since we're on a podcast about young players, to be harsh on weaknesses than it is to underplay them. Specifically for 18 and 19-year-olds, not because it's good for them, but because I think we often underplay what limits players at a young age, and then we overplay it when they get older. It's really easy to criticize somebody's huge weakness in their game when they're 29. Everybody acknowledges it. Everyone agrees. But any criticism of a weakness, I think, ultimately gets swept under the rug if people are enthusiastic about a player when they're young. So I don't see an issue with harking on that and considering whether it's a limitation. I think it's the right thing. I think it's the right way to approach the idea.
You know what? You've made me feel a lot better about going in hard on him there, because it's something which I think is important when you're assessing a player, particularly those who are young. I think it's important to not cheerlead. It's important to analyze. And yeah, I hadn't actually considered it from that perspective, because if a player has played 10, 11 years of professional football and they still have a little weakness in their game, then people are going to exploit that and say, well, this is something which needs rectifying. Whereas if it's a young player, I think a lot of the time, allowances are made.